Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fifth seminar of the 2021 ROK-US Think Tank Seminar Series. The title of today's seminar is Media and Public Opinion, ROK-US Relations from the Perspective of American Media. My name is Alec Chung. I'm a research director at the Jeju Peace Institute, the host organization of this seminar, and I'll be the moderator today. And this 2021 ROK-US Think Tank Seminar is a project funded by the Republic of Korea Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So as the title of the seminar implies, today we are going to have discussions regarding how American media portrays the ROK-US relations, the two Koreas, South Korea and North Korea. Whether media report and distribute unbiased, impartial information to the audience and the voters, or how media filter, prime, and frame the news and wield influence in shaping public opinion. What are the elements that shape images of foreign countries, and how that casts positive or negative images of foreign countries such as South Korea or North Korea. And we will also discuss why there are so many misleading news regarding North Korea. What's going on inside that pariah state, or also known as the Hermit Kingdom? Where is this misinformation coming from? Why is it keep being produced and reproduced? And whether the media is responsible for the production and spread of misinformation. So we know that media is not impartial. But we also cannot deny that media has a huge influence on shaping public's views, thoughts, and perceptions towards certain issues or certain countries. We all first read or hear about a certain country or certain issue through the media, what the media release, publish, or live broadcast. Unless you work at a government bureaus or agencies and you have a source who can provide unfiltered information to you. So understanding how media portrays specific issues, topics, and how that might establish perceptions, perspective, and beliefs are important, because it can shape public opinion, which could, again, indirectly affect government's foreign policies toward other countries, especially in democracies. So regarding the topics, we have two distinguished presenters and three distinguished discussions for today's seminar. Our first speaker is Professor Shang E from the Department of Political Science at Sogang University. And second speaker is Professor Chosun from the Klein College of Media and Communication and Temple University. And our first discussant is Professor Jin from the Department of Political Science at Kookmin University. And our second discussant is Mr. David Nakamura, Washington Post staff writer. And our third discussant is Mr. Tim Martin, Korea Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal. Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's seminar. So here's how we are going to proceed. The two presenters will have a maximum of 20 minutes each for their presentation. So that will be 40 minutes in total. And then after the two presentations, three discussants will have a maximum of 10 minutes each to comment on the presentations. So that would be 30 minutes in total. And after the discussants' comments, presenters will again have 5 to 10 minutes each to respond to the comments they got from the discussants. Then if we have some time left, we'll have an open discussion before we wrap up this seminar. So without further delay, let's welcome our first presenter, Professor Shang E. The title of the presentation is South Korea in the US Media. Professor Ha, please feel free to use your 20 minutes. Thank you.
It's my great honor to be part of this webinar. And what I'm going to present today is how South Korea has been described by the US media. As I have an expertise in basically political psychology and public opinion. But I'm not that interested in the role of a media, as I'm affiliated with the political science department. So I'm going to give you some ideas how we can apply the theories of the media in the field of political psychology to understand the current events and then current the articles and newspaper the reports that are relevant to the South Korea and North-South relations described in the US media. So the first part of my presentation is rather theoretical, and then the second part of my the presentation where I try to apply the theoretical arguments to some issues, the important issues that we are interested in now in the US the Korea relations. All right, so why do we care about media? I mean, it's a very simple question, but we have a simple answer because the media provide the information and then they help us to make a decision and then help ordinary citizens to make a decision in the elections and help political analysts to make important decisions related to foreign policies and on and on and on. Okay. So the media is a source of information and for both the individual citizens and political analysts. And then, so when we see how the individuals or political analysts they formulate opinions using information from the media, so we may have a very useful the formula, okay, like this. So opinion, okay, that's individual opinion that refers to predispositions and the information. Now, likewise, we can make a simplification for analysts, the decision making, so where the final decision by political analysts and political leaders is a combination between predispositions and information. Okay, and then here the information usually comes from the media. Of course, I mean, in the case of the political analysts, the information can come from intelligence agency like the CIA in the United States. Okay, and then the predisposition matter. The predisposition predispositions are independent of information, and then predispositions in the case of individuals usually include ideology. Okay, as you know, I mean, some individuals are politically liberal and others are politically conservative. And the values, personality, so values in this case, some individuals are religious and others are not religious, the value. The personality, I mean, some individuals are experts and others are the introvert. Yeah, all those kind of things can be included in a category predispositions. Yeah. So likewise, in the case of the elites, so predispositions also work. There are liberal leaders, conservative leaders, and the values like George W. Bush. I mean, that was very religious, and then the Obama is, relatively speaking, is not. The personality is also different. Then what I'm going to emphasize today is in the case of the elite decision making, a type of predisposition, the images of foreign countries may exert an important effect in making a final decision, and that is usually covered by the media. Okay, images of the foreign countries, I mean, that's something that I'm going to discuss later. Okay, so we have a formula, so predisposition plus information, and assuming that the information given by media is accurate, impartial, neutral, and unbiased. I know, I mean, that is a big assumption, okay, unrealistic, but I mean, just assume that, okay, so for the sake of simplicity, okay, then we have three types of individual voters. Okay, so first voter is informed voter. Okay, a voter has a sufficient amount of information from the media, and then we usually call that kind of a voter a rational voter. And on the other side, there is an uninformed voter or irrational voter. Then that voter doesn't have a sufficient amount of information to make a right decision in elections. And the third category is very interesting. It's called the rationalizing voter. Here, I mean, we are able to identify the role of predispositions. Okay, unlike informed voters or uninformed voters, the rationalizing voters gather and digest information using predispositions. By doing so, rationalizing voters fail to process information in an objective manner. Okay, and the theoretical underpinning for rationalizing voter is motivated reasoning in the field of psychology. Okay, and I don't have enough time to talk about that, so I'm going to pass it. And then now, you may add one more category to this list. Okay, misinformed voter. Okay, so media, okay, provides some misinformation, and then some people are prone to the misinformation. So you may add one more category to this list. Okay. Hey, same for political analysts. So there's informed decision, uninformed decision, misinformed decision. Okay, like the case of the weapons of mass destruction in the war in Iraq. Okay, by George W. Bush administration, misinformed decision, and then rationalizing decision. Okay, so political analysts digest information from the media or from the intelligence agency using predispositions. Okay, so. Okay, basically the idea is basically the same between the individuals and political analysts. Okay. Let me talk more about the rationalizing voter. Okay, so this is just an example. Okay, the rationalizing voters or rationalizing political analysts can cause the produce, different outcomes by the digesting information in a different manner. Okay, so this is a hypothetical situation where you see on the information that is a neutral information, which is a yellow. And if the ideologically progressive voter or decision maker, okay, so progressive, okay, that is the blue, okay, so Democratic Party blue, okay, so predisposition is blue. And if the ideologically progressive voter or ideologically progressive political analysts take advantage of predispositions in digesting information, okay, that voter or that political analyst will have green opinion. So, okay. But in the case of ideologically conservative voter or political analysts, okay, when they take advantage of the predispositions freely in digesting information, then red plus the yellow, okay, that is orange. Okay, so that means the information is given as a yellow, but the final outcome will be completely different, okay, because of the role of predispositions. And then what I would like to argue here is okay, so media provides information, everybody knows that, but the media oftentimes reinforce predispositions. So by doing so, the media provide inaccurate, unbiased, partial information to voters and political analysts. That's probably one of the most serious problems. So we have to solve regarding the media in democratic countries. Okay. So when we read the textbooks regarding the media and public opinion, okay, so we can learn a lot of the well-observed effect of media, like agenda setting, priming, and framing, and then I assume that so everybody in this room, okay, are well conversant with them, so I'm gonna pass it. Okay, so the idea is, so there's should be balance, okay, between among these three actors, so media, analysts, and citizens. Okay, so analysts care about the citizens' opinion, and then analysts they get information from the media. Then citizens get information from the media, and so all kind of these the circular relationship should be the well balanced to make the particular decisions sound and to make democratic countries work better. Okay. But so what I have to talk as of now is based on an assumption. So assuming that the media is impartial, okay, and the unbiased. But those the assumptions are unrealistic, as you know. So it is safe to assume that the media is not impartial. Okay, the reasons are basically two. So journalists are individuals who hold their own predispositions. We can easily divide the media outlets into two the categories. I mean, liberal media and the conservative media. And then in the era of polarization, it's easier for us to do that, than before. And then political analysts are also individuals who hold the predispositions. So therefore, it is not safe to assume that the political analysts they gather and digest information in an objective manner. Then it is also unimaginable, for a journalist to report the news and then to offer information in an objective manner, because of the role of predispositions. Then, like I said before, the predisposition of special interest in this presentation is images of foreign countries. Because the presentation is related to the foreign relations. So when we go to a subfield of political science, political psychology, there are many subdivisions in it. And then one subdivision of political psychology is a political psychology in IR, so international relations. So in that field, instead of explaining the international politics using the structural argument or using the domestic factors, in political psychology and IR, they try to explain the international phenomena using the information related to the psychology of political analysts. And then the one theory in that field is called the image theory. So image theory is a political psychological approach that draws connections between decision makers' the image of other countries and their resulting behavior. So simply put, the images of other countries, that is a predisposition, held by political analysts, and then when they make a decision, the relevant to that foreign country, so political analysts tend to use the consciously or unconsciously, they use that predisposition. And the images of a country usually contain the information about the country's capabilities, culture, and the goal compatibility or intention. And the capabilities mean the other country's economic characteristics, military strength, domestic political stability, on and on and on. And then other countries' cultural attribute, simply, that is a question like this, so that country is civilized or not? It's a cultural attribute. And then goal compatibility intention is about whether the national interests are compatible with other countries or not. So the US, the image of South Korea based on goal compatibility is, is the US national interest is compatible with the interest of South Korea or not? Or the intention, that country have a good intention or bad intention. So using these three the factors, so we are able to identify 6 or 7 different images of foreign countries. The first one is ally. So ally is equal in terms of capability and equal in terms of civilization, culture, and then good intention. That is ally. And the enemy, so equal capability, equal culture, and intention is harmful. The barbarian and imperialist, colonial, degenerate, rogue, and so you name it. So this is what the political psychologists in IR have they found and identified using a series of empirical studies. And then after identifying the other country as an ally or something else, the country can make a strategy appropriate to the image of the image of other countries. So just an example, if the country is the other country is considered as an enemy, then the containment is the best strategy. But if the other country is considered as a rogue, then crush that. That country is probably the best strategy. And then this is what basically media use in describing other countries. And this is what basically the political elites use in determining, in making their decisions regarding the other countries. So let's apply the image theory to South Korea and North Korea. Then South Korea, in the perspective of the US, has been considered an ally for a long time, but I'm not an expert in text analysis, but probably someone can do it. Okay, so during and right after the Korean War, probably, South Korea was not considered as an ally. Rather, South Korea was considered as a colonial. Okay, so some country that should be protected by the United States. Okay, then under Trump administration, the description of South Korea was a little bit different. Okay, South Korea was considered as a parasite. Okay, so the South Korea is rich, but still take advantage of the U.S. interest. Okay, so that's what Trump said. Okay, so we are able to identify some overtime trends. So how South Korea is described by media, especially U.S. media, they're using these images. Okay, same for North Korea. So usually enemy, but sometimes South Korea was considered as a rock. And then after the development of nuclear weapons by North Korea, North Korea is considered as a degenerate. Okay, there's also the overtime, the change in the describing the North Korea using those images. Okay, this is something we have to identify. It's a very good, I would say, good topic for a scholarly article. Okay. And then an example, the recent example, okay, so Washington Post, okay, Mr. Nakamura. Okay. And there's the article published by Washington Post the last week, and then written by Jennifer Lind and Derek Press, the political scientist at Dartmouth College. The article was a little bit, I would say, some people around me was shocked by this article, okay, because it has been taboo to talk about the allowing for the development of nuclear weapons in South Korea, but authors actually propose it. Okay, so say that once a strong alliance between South Korea and US is weakening, so therefore, it is necessary for South Korea to build its own nuclear bomb. Okay. For what? Okay, so that's what these are the authors wrote here. Okay, now when we read this article carefully, okay, so South Korea is basically considered as an ally. But as the title suggests, okay, the once a strong alliance between South Korea and the US is weakening. Okay, so that means it may not necessarily for us to consider the South Korea as an ally anymore because the environment has changed. And then there's a description about the image of South Korea during the Trump administration, okay? And say that the Trump made it clear that he thought that South Korea was taking advantage of the United States, okay? So the image in here, the image of South Korea is not ally. That is kind of the degenerate, the parasite. So in this particular article, so we can identify multiple the image of South Korea, and then of course, I'm not saying that one image is dominant and then the other is not. Okay, but so what I would like to say here is, the South Korea is, even though the South Korea has been considered as an ally, but we can identify other images of South Korea in the US media. Plus, this article, at least to me, is based on the cherry-picked information. Okay, so the authors say that some analysis in the nuclearization is a non-starter, and then there's a citation, and then the others say they provide them an opposite opinion. There's a citation. Okay, but those citations, I would say, are not that balanced. Okay, and then the people cited here, I'm not sure whether they are influential, the politicians or not. Okay, so that Therefore, I mean, the information source is a little bit unreliable. I mean, at least to me. Okay. So to conclude, I would say that the U.S. media doesn't put some full information on South Korea. I mean, same for the South Korea. But the small number of experts, I mean, tend to manipulate the image of South Korea in the U.S. media. But I mean, like I said, that the images of South Korea vary, depending on the situation. Then the fundamental problem is the U.S. media is not free from some predispositions. Okay, so like it says images of a foreign country, and then probably, I mean, you may add, I mean, political ideology of a journalist or something else. But the good news here is both South Korea and United States are democratic countries. Therefore, the freedom of speech is guaranteed by the Constitution and then by practice and by custom. Okay. Therefore, as I mean, the people say different opinions, but the freely, and then there's we can create a marketplace of ideas, and then eventually, I mean, the good news will trump the bad news. That's my hope. So that kind of a possibility is greater in the United States and South Korea rather than in the authoritarian countries. Okay, like I mean the China. Okay, now I mean Hong Kong as well. Okay, so there I mean marketplace of ideas is really difficult to be built. Okay, in that sense, I mean the role of public diplomacy also important in correcting the image of South Korea and correcting the image of the United States in the other countries. Okay, but another problem I would like to add here is, I mean, there's a tension between democracy and bureaucracy, especially in the foreign policies. Okay, so domestic policies. In democratic countries, the domestic policies, I mean, tend to be determined by public opinion. Okay, so no doubt about it, because I mean, we need, I mean, democratic legitimacy. But in the case of foreign policies, the bureaucracy they tend to be dominant over democracy. So I mean, it's very important to make a balance between the public opinion and then opinions of experts in the case of a foreign policy. But that's something we have to examine what happened before and then what will happen later in the relation between the U.S. the South Korea relations, okay, regarding the relationship between democracy and bureaucracy. Okay. Right. That's all I have today. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ha. Yeah. So let's welcome our second presenter, Professor Soomin. Yeah, the title of the presentation is How Misinformation on North Korea Gets Produced and Distributed, Case of Dead North Korea. So Professor Soe, feel free to use your 20 minutes. Thank you.
All right, so thank you. So this research has roots in a paradox that I started noticing increasingly ever since Kim Jong-un took over after his father. So over the last 2 decades, there has been, steady increase in the, in journalistic access to North Korea. So starting, with APTN, Kyodo, AP, AFP, Reuters, these are all news institutions that have bureaus there. And I'm not even, adding the, the Xinhua or, the Russian news agencies who've been there for quite a long time. You also have parachuting reporters from, there was a time when just about everyone from the Washington Post to CNN, LA Times, CNN was there a lot, I remember. New Yorker, Evan Osnos was there. So you have the whole stream of reporters from virtually all of, Western media. This was all pre-COVID, of course. The last couple of years, I know there was very few, there was scant presence. But also, as a city, Pyongyang is hardly the hermit regime, sealed off place, like mysterious place anymore. It is a city where surprisingly, large number of diplomats from countries, the EU, UK, Australia, as well as NGOs, tourists, and business people. And I mention all of these because these are all potential sources for journalists, right? And then, of course, there's the introduction of technologies within North Korea. Although North Korean cell phones can't make calls to international phone numbers. There people usually like do some phone relays. So information circulating within North Korea is, so there's been all these changes. And of course, you have journalists who continue to do the bulk of the North Korea coverage from outside, right? So Seoul, Washington, D.C., Beijing, and Tokyo. So with all these changes, some things remained unchanged. And that was the paradox. The repeated pattern of errors, major sort of, I'm not going to say misinformation, just erroneous stories, right? Because I don't want to say there was intent to deceive, certainly not on the part of journalists. Just last year, you might recall that CNN reported, a bunch of news organizations reported Kim Jong-un is deathly ill. And these are some of the people you probably know who they are. Lee Young-gil on the left, Hyun Song-wol, Ma Won-chun on the right, all of whom are powerful North Koreans who were supposed to be dead, only to be proven wrong later. They came back from the dead. So we have, since the Sunshine Policy days of the early 2000s, it's been more than 2 decades. There's accumulated expertise on the part of journalists. North Korea is, despite its limitations, hardly the hermetic, mysterious regime it is. So why do these errors repeat themselves, despite better access and more experience? So that was the paradox, that was the question. So what are the factors leading to this strong pattern of journalistic errors? So I wanted to briefly introduce the stuff that we talk about in media sociology, news sociology. So when it comes to news production, media sociologists talk about the multiple influences in media coverage. So, there are scholars by the name of Pam Shoemaker and Steve Reese who kind of try to put in, sort of sum up all these existing research. So at the top, you have the ideological national level, right? Of course, national interest drives coverage. There's, no shortage of research that shows that. There's social, cultural, dimensions, media organizational dynamics, all the way down to the individual level. So to understand how misinformation or and of course, this is where disinformation seeps in, right? Like fake news. So how all of these things somehow make their way into mainstream media outlets and get distributed, I wanted to reach over to go to the production side. So the data that I primarily dealt with are the 3 major newspapers, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, and 11 national dailies in South Korea. And from these samples, I identified 7 clear-cut cases where journalistic errors could be confirmed with certainty, which means that person literally was reported to have died or executed and came back very much alive. And these 7 cases are also when the errors were global. It wasn't just one news outlet, it crossed borders, snowballed into something quite different. So that's from 2012, so Kim Jong-un era, to 2019. If I relaxed these rules to include cases where, somebody's supposed to be missing or is, rumored to be dead, then it becomes more like a dozen. So there are a lot of those cases. And I should probably add here that I used to work as a journalist covering North Korea, and I made half a dozen trips to places like Pyongyang and Kaesong. So there's a sort of an ethnographic component here as well as a researcher. Although these, I was there in like 2000 and 2001. So here's an overview of the 7 cases. So you would see the names of, I think with this audience, you all know who they are. Very famous, very familiar. On the second column, you have the initial report. In the source, these are the, how they were named, the sources. Sources in China was how all the initial Hyun Song-wol story was sort of, based upon. And then Chang Song-taek. And then on the next column, you have how, major outlets that picked up these stories who sort of, it's a longer list. I just picked the ones that are kind of bigger. The ones in bold are obviously American outlets. And then to the right, you have the date proven wrong. Note how North Korea is also responding more quickly. They, in their own logic, they too are trying to say, hey, with Hyun Sung-wol, it took It took like more than 7 months, 8 months for them to say actually Hyun Sung-wol is alive. But with Kim Hyuk-chul, it's like there was news coverage in May, and barely 2 months later, that was the NIS. But again, North Korea is also in its own way trying to sort of say actually you're wrong and this person is alive. So Chang Sung-taek's case is perhaps the most famous. I mean, of course, Chang Sung-taek is indeed dead, but I'm referring to the two major journalistic blunders surrounding this. And I mean, this is the single most infamous incident, right, that really lit the fire to this genre of. I mean, this is Kim Jong-un's uncle, powerful man, rumored to be number 2. This was shortly after Kim Jong-un assumed power. So this was a big deal, but there were 2 major gaps that I wanted to point towards. So first was that he was prematurely reported to have been executed. The next day, and the pictures left was what North Korea showing, actually no, we have this thing called a court, and there's due process, here we are. So he was indeed executed shortly after that. But the bigger blunder that the media reported, which much detail, was, of course, that he and his 5 associates were fed to 120 dogs that had not eaten for 3 days, witnessed by 300 senior officials. This originated in Wenwei-po, a Beijing-controlled newspaper, which was picked up 2 weeks later by Straits Times. As a former journalist, I think it had a lot to do with the fact that this was during the holidays, and that some of the gatekeeping verification mechanisms are kind of loose, maybe. But again, because Straits Times is a reputable news institution, it led to this major global cascade with many news outlets embarrassingly quoting them. And here on the right, you're looking at Fox News. Turns out that Wenwei-po had a single source, one source, and it was a satirical piece by a blogger on the Chinese social media, which went unchecked and ultimately got picked up by the likes of NBC. And then you have Hyun Sung-wol. I don't mean, she's the popular former singer and leader of the North Korean Samjiyeon Orchestra. And in August 2013, South Korea's biggest newspaper, Chosun-ilbo, reported, quoting one anonymous Chinese source, that Hyun, reportedly an ex-girlfriend of Kim Jong-un, and 10 other famous musicians and dancers had been executed for the creation and sales of indecent, that is, pornographic material. And this, and the original report, so you're this is showing the trajectory of coverage of Hyun Sung-wol's death. So, and the right column is the source. So Chosun-ilbo initially reported, same sources in China, 중국 소식통, and then it got picked up by other Korean media outlets. The next day, unfortunately, Wall Street Journal picked up Chosun's, they quoted Chosun without additional coverage. I mean, this is routine work in the world of international reporting, and I get that, but it did lead to a global cascade, unfortunately. Radio Free Asia, they have defector journalists on board, and they claim that they also had some additional sources in addition to Chosun report, and then other South Korean, and then another breakthrough was Asahi of Japan reports that they too confirmed by recent defectors, and so on, and you kind of see the whole. But as you know, Hyun rose from the dead when she was very much in charge during the public diplomacy artist performances during the Winter Olympics, right? And also during the Inter-Korean Summit. So anonymity of sources. I mean, part of this is inevitable, and I get that. I mean, you can't, to the extent to which you need anonymous sources. But even taking that into consideration, it was just really routine and excessive use of anonymity when it comes to North Korea, meaning little effort goes into securing additional sources, right? And to the right, you're seeing the Society of Professional Journalists, a respected professional organization in the US. It has an ethics code, and these are some of the parts on anonymity. It says you should try to identify them, verify your reliability, even if you can't reveal their identity on the pages, right? Common sense. And also, I mean, part of the problem I realized when I was analyzing the content is that there's a lot of code in there. So again, going back to what Professor Haha had said, because some of the coverage was really targeting the elites, right? So you can kind of decipher what this means if you're in the know. So in Korean, for example, 소식통 refers to civilian, non-government sources, right? 관계자 means a certain level, so that kind of thing. But readers have no way of knowing that. Again, that is very prominent. Many of the anonymous sources are, of course, defectors, and there's a legitimate reason. I mean, there's a fear for their personal safety. This is a snapshot of the number of defectors who arrived in South Korea. The vast majority of them end up in South Korea, obviously. The number means that you can find a defector from any walks of life, from any region in North Korea, and that's why they're so valuable, right? And defectors serve a role as what the sociologist Manuel Castells called switchers. These are individuals serving as nodes of information, connecting the two Koreas with the outside world. Defectors are not only sources, but they're increasingly journalists in major outlets. Chosun, Donghwa, Yonhap, RFA, VOA, they all have journalists, and they do important, very good work. In fact, it was Yonhap's Choi Sun-young who broke the story that Kim Jong-un had been appointed heir. It was a global scoop. So, but unchecked use of defector testimonies, right? Or through the grapevine reporting, because defectors continue to communicate with their friends back home, is problematic. And it's something that South Korean journalists are doing less these days, partly because they have other ways to verify. But Western media, including American media, is kind of addicted to the human stories. I think it does have something to do with the love of the narrative, right? The defector narratives are very powerful. So one of my interviewees pointed out that, this person had worked both in South Korea and the US, pointed out that when it comes to coverage about North Korea, the defectors have, they yield some power too. I mean, if you think about the Bush administration, when defectors rose in prominence, you think about all the testimonies they gave in Capitol Hill, and that led to the passage of a human rights law in North Korea, right? And this led to a stronger stream of money flowing to defector projects, which of course are, it's a good thing. The problem is that it also motivated cash-strapped defectors to compete to sell their stories. And if you're a journalist, I think you all know of, defectors who shouldn't be used. I don't want to blame them. I want to blame the structure, the media using their stories without additional verification. Right. And Yeonmi Park is actually a case in point, because just the other day I saw a story about her, I think in the New York Times. But she has been known to exaggerate, there are so many inconsistencies which had been pointed out as early as 2014. But she fits into very certain, these days I think she has sort of sided with the sort of a Republican sort of party it's a very unique position that she's occupying. She's been criticizing the safety of the New York City because she was mugged by African Americans. It's very bizarre, but again she has that value. So again, such loose sourcing practices leads to, it really leads to this snowball of bad coverage, right? And what you're seeing is one of the reasons I didn't want to, although the theme of the day is, US media, I didn't want to focus just on US media, because this is indeed global, and that the guards are kind of, some of the safety mechanisms, I think, are lowered when you are coding media from another country. And the Chinese and Japanese media are also playing a bigger role in this ecosystem. So some of the, really reputable ones like Asahi of Japan, they have played a role in Hyunsong, they're saying they have verified it. And also the Chinese web is this place you can find anything you want. And also, just think about, the sort of the breakdown of how the process didn't work. When you have something like, something as suspicious as like 300 officials, watching for 3 hours while 120 dogs were eating Jang, so it should have, gotten the alarm bells off, but for some reason it didn't. And of course, and that leads to a related concern, which is, which we talk about a lot in journalism studies, the PAC mentality, right? The huge cliques. There's a lot of interest. Obviously, North Korea is, is interesting for a number of reasons, but also the fear of missing out. And the unique, the close nature, the fact that there's no spokesperson you can call up and say, I mean, I know some journalists can, call up the North Korean representatives at the United Nations in New York and probably, arrange for a meeting. But still, except for those instances, you can't verify things in North Korea. But hey, it's North Korea, so let me just write and see what happens. Attitude is, has often happens more often with North Korea. So, and of course, such impulses are most visible in tabloid media in the UK, which again, because it's, Anglo-American media, English, same language, it's some of this type of coverage appears a lot in like New York Post, for example. If you conduct a search for Kim Jong-un in The Sun, the British tabloid, you get 1,500 hits, which is much more than you would get from Chosun or Hangyeore. So, so it's those papers. So here I bring to you, the words of, just to show you how strong the demand is, the words of Choi Sang-hoon, the New York Times bureau chief. He points out the problem of anything goes attitude. And it's so tempting to write a sensational story based on a single defector testimony. And he says, like, I get pressure too. I get calls from the New York office saying, hey, like all the others are writing, why don't you write? So again, the kind of the underlying logic is that, well, since this is a global pariah with dismal human rights record, don't you have some latitude? So, and as he says towards the end, well, they know that no one in Pyongyang will sue you or ask for corrections. So to come back to our original model, what I've shown you very quickly is that in addition to what we know, of course, ideology, sort of the Cold War mentality, of course, these things continue to shape. It's no coincidence that Chosun Ilbo, the conservative media, continues to write a lot of these stories. But, and of course, there's individual inaptitude. Of course, some people who don't know a lot about North Korea, obviously, or don't have the resources to cultivate, sources who are real experts. But I wanted to point out to the sort of the meso levels, the ones in the middle, right? The organizational sort of imperative. North Korea generates traffic. It gets the clicks. I mean, and again, even in elite outlets, you're not immune from that kind of impulses. And this is particularly the case with broadcast media, right? It gets the ratings. They're very sensitive, much more so than print. And the culture is something that I think that gets very little mentioned, which is why I highlighted in green, because there's a lot of caricaturization of North Korea, making fun. Again, going back to what Professor Ha said, there's obviously journalism informs, but journalism also entertains, right? Especially it's been turned into a show oftentimes, and North Korea kind of fits that component pretty well, making fun of this weird country, which is what you are seeing increasingly. So to conclude, my research shows that we need to think about not only politics obviously is very important, but also the structural, cultural issues in news coverage of North Korea. We need to think about, security commercialism, is sort of 안보 상업주의 in Korean, sort of the profit motives of North Korea and the global media that sustains that kind of a less than desirable substandard journalism in North Korea. And I named it negative exceptionalism. I know it's not the way you would use exceptionalism, for instance, in political science, but I just couldn't find another name for it because, again, North Korea is this exception to the rule that you don't, you don't question things, and the lack of correction is something that really hurts. As somebody who teaches, who works with undergraduates in journalism, it thinks like you can make mistakes, but where are the corrections, right? CNN tends to have this like, oh, shrug. Sorry, I guess our sources weren't entirely, they weren't really good. That kind of, I tried very hard to find corrections. That's what they said. Looks like they weren't exactly trustworthy. Chosun Ilbo just last year issued a correction of their Hyun Sung-won story. So again, that took how many years, right? I must say there has been a huge improvement in recent years, especially in the US media, and that has a lot to do with, I mean, good journalists like the ones with us today. The British media actually has a really dismal record, and that's for another presentation. BBC, like, do not get me started. And of course, there's a long history, right? Like going back to 1997, when CIA predicted that North Korea would collapse under 5 years, right? And there was this whole slew of media coverage saying it will definitely collapse. And as the one Atlantic article once said, quote, that they've been so consistently wrong might say as much about the outside world as it does about North Korea, unquote. So yeah, so that's pretty much it. So I wanted to end with a joke in Pyongyang. This is an actual joke I heard when I was in North Korea. Why does North Korea not believe in Christianity? And the answer is, it's because people keep coming back from the dead. So the new joke that I made up was, why don't people believe the news media? And again, the answer would be, because people keep coming back from the dead. So thank you very much. This is me 20 years ago, hanging out with the North Koreans as a journalist. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Soe. Okay, so let's move on to discussions. So our first discussant is Professor Jin from the Kookmin University. So Professor Chang, please feel free to use your 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Jin Chang from Kookmin University. I'm happy to be here as a part of this interesting seminar. Okay, it was very interesting to hear about this theory of images portrayed by the media and the images of the South Korea described in the US media presented by Professor Ha. But I'm not really sure if this is an objective judgment or something from my personal bias as a political scientist who tend to downplay the role of media. Okay, basically the reason why we care about media, the reason why we are doing this right now is because they may potentially influence the policy making of the United States towards the foreign policy making of the United States towards the North Korea or South Korea. But I'm wondering today, really, I mean, in the slides that the Professor Ha showed, the arrows runs both, the arrows run both ways between the elites and media, between media and voters. Do they really run both ways? I'm not really sure about that. Okay, between the media and the voters, mostly I think I'm not really an expert in political communication, so this is just my personal view. But the more realistic model should be the arrow comes from the media to the voter, not the other way around, because the voters, most of the voters do not have a tangible experience with foreign countries. So the most of the information they get about the foreign policy or foreign country must be from the media. So, and on the other hand, the arrow between the elites and the media, where maybe the media by describing a foreign policy in a particular way may influence the policy making of the government, but I'm not really sure if that area of influence is really that big. And mainly there is 3 reasons why I'm doubtful about the influence of the media on the foreign policy making. The first reason is I'm not sure where these images that the media use in describing a particular country comes from. I mean, Professor Ha talked about the cherry picking information, and Professor Soe talked about the local media in that particular countries. But and Professor Ha talked about the cherry picking information, but that must be natural. I mean, it's a foreign country. The media doesn't cover all the stories, everything that's going on in that country. They pick up the news that is newsworthy, and those events should are expected to be highly dependent on what's already happening between the two countries. I mean, so media, not really sure if the media lead the events. They must, in most of the cases, they follow the events that are already happening between the countries. The events that are depending on already made foreign policies of the government. So that's the first reason. I mean, the media, the images that the media use, they themselves comes from what the political elites already decided and already implemented towards the particular country. And the second is, and this is I believe a common sense between the political scientists who study the elections and the voters' behavior. Political elites are mostly driven by electoral incentives, but at the same time, foreign policy issues are not salient issue during the election. And like I said, the foreign policy issues are not the issues that the voters has a tangible experience, and the voters form their own like a personal interest. So, which means maybe the elites are in making foreign policies, elites may be influenced by the images that voters have towards the country, but that also means, the second reason also means the elites have a lot of leeways to manipulate them. And the third, this is I think one of the most important changes in the media environment. The images of a particular country are not just coming from mainstream media these days. There is a lot of widespread new media like SNS or YouTube. And because, I mean, the role of the mainstream media is decreasing, and the role of this new media, which are not really dependent on this traditional role, may not be characterized as this traditional role of the media. So maybe the image that the media is selling towards the voters and elites should be competing with other very different types of images that this new media is producing. So I mean, these are maybe some other reasons. There must be maybe some other reasons. But to wrap up my discussion, if we want to talk about, or if we really want to talk about how the U.S. media portraying the South Korea and North Korea, the fundamental question we must ask: what is the extent to which these medias are actually influencing the foreign policy making of the United States towards these countries? Okay. 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 That's pretty much it for now.
Thank you very much, Professor Chang. Moving on to our second discussion, Washington Post staff writer, Mr. David Nakamura. Mr. Nakamura, you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to the Jeju Peace Institute for this lively and informative discussion. And I think, in responding to what Soomin said, I first wanted to say that I thought her presentation was very thorough and in many ways very accurate. And I was reminded of the quote often attributed to the American writer Mark Twain, that when contacted by a journalist about his own death, he said, "Tell them that reports of my death are greatly exaggerated." A quote that was later said to apparently have been exaggerated in the retelling, which I think goes to show that American media has had a problem getting its facts straight for a long time. It's, it comes with the territory, I think, of what we do. I would say, though, that especially now, given what we've seen and what some of the other panelists have said about the state of our information sources and the many sources in which information is now put out, sometimes inaccurately, we have a bigger responsibility than ever to get it right and to sometimes wait if we don't know all the facts. And we have a real problem doing that. I think, I wanted to go back to last year that Soomin mentioned the CNN report about Kim Jong-un being gravely ill or even dead, when all the speculation that sparked on social media and then in follow-up reporting, often recklessly by other outlets. I did end up writing a piece related to that within a few days of those reports. And I went back and just read it because I wanted to see what I had written. And I think it's instructive because, you know, in looking back at that story, it started in something called the Daily NK, which I think is an outlet run by defectors. And Soomin accurately talked about the problem relying only on the extraordinary stories of defectors who we think have this insider view, and they do, but have an agenda. And reporters always have to be aware of how we are being used and try to be as transparent with our readers or viewers about where our information is coming from and why people are telling us what they do, and the potential that they're trying to use us for their advantage. You know, from there, CNN then picked up the story, as did other outlets, and I went back and looked at that. And CNN quoted not just the Daily NK, but also an unnamed U.S. official and in the Trump administration. I think that led to the idea that there was more behind this than we understood, and that is also very troubling. We know the Trump administration's problem with alternative facts and truthfulness and full disclosure. We don't know who this official is. It could have been a career official in the State Department. It could have been someone in Seoul. We don't know. That's part of CNN's concern about disclosing their sources. But that elevated the story. And then we got the call, as Soomin talked about, quoting the New York Times bureau ex-bureau chief in Seoul. You know, we got those of us who cover the Trump White House and elsewhere. Well, can you confirm this? I look back at my story. And this is another thing that I think to keep in mind as we read stories, whether it's on foreign policy or Kim Jong-un's health or cultural issues inside North Korea that seem weird, or reports that Kim is feeding his in-laws to the dogs. And that is, a lot of the coverage is not sort of firsthand, certainly, and then is not just even rewrite of something that's already out there, but playing off the news. And then it gives, I think, more credence maybe to the original report than is intended. And I look back and I recall that my colleagues in our Japan bureau who cover Korea also had put up an early file as best they could trying to address this story. Because now, sometimes we could, in the old days, we might be able to ignore a story if it was in a print newspaper somewhere outside our city and say that we don't have the story. And we can still do that, certainly. But there was a lot of pressure to report on this. And my colleague in Asia put up an early story, you know, even overnight as we were sleeping, perhaps, I can't remember, talking about that the South Korean government, sources there were saying they did not have confirmation of this. They tried to address it as forthrightly as they could. Throughout the day, that story was on our homepage, got a lot of attention. However, when I came to work, I said, well, you know, there's a political story here. President Trump has this direct line of communication to Kim Jong-un that he personally developed with these summits. But yet the US government is being quoted as saying they're monitoring reports that Kim is gravely ill. Well, why are they saying that? Robert O'Brien, the US National Security Advisor, went on TV and was asked about the report and said, we are aware of the reports and we're monitoring it closely. He didn't discount it. The US government might not have known. And I quoted a former intelligence official, now works at a prominent think tank, in the story saying they might not know the truth. And they might be saying on TV that they are monitoring it because they don't want to look like they don't know. That's a problem. But also, I decided that this story said something else, that it's possible the Trump administration did not want to disclose that they knew he was in poor health or otherwise, but it's also possible they didn't know and the President Trump didn't know. And that was embarrassing or you know, shed light on their diplomacy and the lack of actual you know, true communication when it matters. And so I wrote a story saying this whole scenario, as extraordinary as it is and how unlikely it is that he's actually sick or dead, and we just don't know, also demonstrates something about the Trump administration's diplomacy here, that in a critical moment, when we're talking about secession, we're talking about potential war, all sorts of outbreak of what could happen if Kim Jong-un dies, the president and the White House didn't know what to say, and they weren't saying anything. And that itself may have been a strategy and maybe the right foreign policy decision, but it wasn't clear at a time of real global uncertainty. And so that's how we sort of, I think, dealt with it. I dealt with it. I will say that, you know, some of your viewers may know I did go to the both summits between Trump and Kim. And I did ask Kim Jong-un a question and was the first foreign reporter to get a response. It was, you know, you might say a softball. I asked how the negotiations were going, but he answered. And, you know, I try to go to the source. Final thing I would say to sort of address what Soomin said was, it is difficult still to report on North Korea. And Soomin has much better understanding of dynamics even several years ago when she was able to go than we do. But we had a bureau chief who had been twice, named Anna Fiffield, who's now since left the paper. But she was a very accomplished journalist and was our bureau chief in Tokyo. And she had gone to North Korea twice as a reporter for her previous publication, Reuters, because she's a New Zealand native and did not have a problem with getting a visa that sometimes US journalists do. But for the Washington Post, I don't believe she was able to go. Which demonstrates we have not had someone go there that I can remember in a long time, aside from we did have a reporter go with Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and was confined basically to the hotel in Pyongyang the entire 36 hours they were on the ground. I've gone certainly to the demilitarized zone a couple times, but other than that, we've not been there. And I think that I've quoted Jean Lee, who was an AP bureau chief there and is now at the Wilson Center in Washington for my stories, along with other sources. But we did have, the final note, we have been burned. And, my colleague, Blaine Harden, a very accomplished foreign correspondent who has since left the Post, wrote a book in 2012. Many of you may be familiar, Escape from Camp 14, a very harrowing account, which I read about the story of a escapee, Defector, who then later changed the story and basically acknowledged that a lot of it was embellished and basically had to retract almost an entire book. And so Blaine learned the hard way. And so we're all continue to learn the hard way. And I do think that Soomin's right that there's no excuse for this anymore. And we have to be as thorough and diligent and responsible on this story, just like any other, especially at this time of misinformation, disinformation, and the problems we can see in the United States that can lead to. So I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nakamura. Yeah. And our third discussant is Mr. Tim Martin, Korea Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal. So, Mr. Martin, please feel free to use your 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation again. It's great to be back. I'm Tim Martin. I'm the Korea Bureau Chief for the Wall Street Journal. I've overseen the newsroom's Korea coverage for the past 3 years or so. So a lot of these incidents were sort of firsthand experiences for me. And I thought both Professor He and Professor Soe made very interesting points. And this is a discussion and a paradigm, a conundrum really that we face all the time, day to day, week to week on North Korea coverage. But it was very interesting to get an outside perspective and an academic perspective on what we do as a group, and in some cases individually, as we saw with one of the citations from Professor Soe. I'll just make a couple of points. Actually being here in Korea, and I mean, we just did a North Korea story yesterday of them slamming Squid Game in state propaganda. So, which evokes some of the themes of the research, for better or for worse. I would say that North Korea is really singularly difficult to cover as a country anywhere in the world. It's extremely closed off. There is no real way to verify a lot of this information outside of North Korea's own state media, and that comes with its own drawbacks and weaknesses. And we can't forget, I mean, one of the data points that really struck me from 2020 was that Kim Jong-un was the world's second most Googled person in the world after Joe Biden. And, part of that was the media created or media driven, craze over is Kim Jong-un dead or alive? But there is and continues to be this massive interest in Kim Jong-un basically as this celebrity political figure. I was not at the first summit, but I was at the Hanoi summit in 2019, and when you just saw all of the cameras following him around, and I remember saying a few times, is this Kim Jong-un or is this Kim Kardashian? There was so much just pure fascination in the guy, about the guy. The next point I would make, perhaps to just contextualize, I don't want to provide an excuse for or a rationale for either of the professor's research, but maybe just to contextualize what the press corps looks like here in Korea. The nature of the press corps, and again, I think if you look at Professor Soe's research, the US media did a slightly better job with accuracy as the years went on, I guess with the death scare being a major exception with that. But if you look at the actual press corps, it sort of changed over time, even from when Professor Soe was a journalist herself in the early 2000s. If I look at my peers at different organizations, New York Times, Washington Post, us, Los Angeles Times, Reuters, Bloomberg, they're all led by bureau chiefs who are either Korean or Korean American and speak some level of Korean. And below that, if you look at most of the reporters they work with, almost all of them are Korean nationals. There's only a handful of traditional, or I shouldn't say traditional, but there are only a handful of people based here who have no connection with Korea previously, who don't speak the language. And I think that's helped with the reporting about North Korea. People who understand the local language can perhaps develop more context from the Seoul side rather than being more reliant on Washington or elsewhere. And I think we'll only see that that trend become more stark in the years ahead. But I think at least locally here, the gatekeepers do know a lot about the Korean story and maybe have lived through a big portion of it. So I think that will help with quality assurance as we go further out. I think I'll just close with sort of two other points. I think, yes, compared to the past, North Korea up until a certain point became more open to journalists and foreign media. They would invite, there was a military parade a few years ago and other events where they would actually invite in foreign press to see something. But really since the pandemic, North Korea was basically the first country to seal off its borders. And this would have been January of 2020. And since then, the exodus from NGOs, certainly academics, diplomats, journalists. North Korea is really the most hermit kingdom it's probably been in decades. You can say that the same for South Korea, where I'm at. I joke that South Korea is more Korean than it's been since the Chosun dynasty, given COVID-19 and the travel restrictions. So that complicates tremendously a story like the one we saw last year with Kim Jong-un's health scare. Traditional sources have either left or are difficult to reach. And with the change in administration from Trump to Biden, we're at this sort of important moment of how does the Kim regime react? And again, the traditional avenues or access points for journalists are really closed off. So I think maybe if you plot it out over the past decade, things have become more open in a way, but since the pandemic, things have really dried up. And that presents a challenge because again, this sort of notion of Kim Jong-un as a celebrity, North Korea as one of the topics that draws a legitimately global audience. There are very few countries in their news dynamics that American readers, European readers, that people all around the world have some baseline level of interest in. So we have this impetus or motivation as newsrooms and journalists. At the same time, we have just a sort of dearth of touch points. That presents a challenge. And I think I do wonder in a macro sense, this sort of increased popularity, journalism, focus on North Korea. I do wonder if this is more good or more, is it good or bad in a sense? Because if you think about all the countries in the world and the foreign policy conundrums they pose to the U.S. and elsewhere, North Korea is staying on the front of mind, right? Because of the press coverage to governments and policymakers all around the world. if we go back 15, 20 years ago, when North Korea really was making its ascent with the nuclear program, the coverage tended to be far sleepier. There was not as much coverage. There was not as much scrutiny and attention. Now, some of the contemporary coverage does go in nefarious or flamboyant areas, but there's also a lot of important policy coverage, really looking almost day to day at what North Korea is up to and what it might mean. So the two questions I wanted to pose to the professors, to Professor Ha, I wanted to ask, he outlined the entrenched views of the two Koreas. South Korea is painted as an ally, North Korea more as an enemy. And I just wonder, to what extent should those images be inversed? Or perhaps should the US media look at this from a different vantage point, and what benefits could that produce? And then to Professor Soe, I'd be very curious to hear her thoughts. Yes, there's a lot of sort of journalism basics in her presentation of accuracy and verification, but how would she, in an idealized sense, like to see North Korea coverage unfold? If she were sort of appointed the czar of North Korean news coverage all around the world, how would the coverage look differently? And would that be better for the world discourse about North Korea or not? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin. And now back to our presenters. And I know Professor Ha and Professor Soe will have a lot to say, but time is running out. So could you limit your answers to like 5 or 6 minutes? Yeah, thank you. So Professor Ha, would you give your answers to our discussants' comments on your presentation? Yeah.
Thank you for all your comments. So your comments, are really helpful for, to elaborate on my ideas in the future. So, let's start with Tim Martin's question. So, I said South Korea has been described as an ally, while the North Korea has been described as an enemy, predominantly by the U.S. media. And there's a possibility of the inverse image. So I would say that the images are not fixed, and then the images of foreign countries may depend on domains. Why I'm saying here is, okay, so it's a domain-specific image. Say that, for example, the Japan has been described as an ally to the United States for a long time, but as we remember, in 1980s, when the economic power of Japan was the dominant, especially in terms of the international trade, the U.S. media and then U.S. political analysts described Japan as a potential enemy. Okay, so there's probably in a similar way. The description of China has that changed. From the some country, the United States have to cooperate to the U.S. that have to compete with. Okay, so the point is that the images are not fixed, but the question is what causes the changes of image of foreign countries. Okay, so sometimes the one hypothesis we have is the media initiated the changes of the image, and then other hypothesis may be the political analysts. For some reason, to manipulate the foreign policy or to implement a specific foreign policy, the political analysts they initiate the changes of the image. Like the case of the George W. Bush, called the North Korea one of the axis of evil. Okay, so that is the strong statement. Okay, try to change the image of North Korea. Okay, so many hypotheses are possible, but okay, as far as I know, so no one actually has provided a conclusive answer. Related to the key determinants of the images of foreign policy, the foreign countries. Okay, so that's probably one of the most important topics for the future research, and that's something definitely worth examining it. Okay, then related to this, the image theory is, as you see, it's a very porous. It is not theoretically thorough, and it sounds like the ad hoc theory rather than the theory based on the strong set of arguments. So therefore, we can have room for elaborate on that theory. Okay, so when I offer the political psychology class, and then where I deal with image theory in a class session, I usually ask the students this question. So suppose that there is a war between Germany and Spain. So who's gonna win? 100% of students say that the Germany will win. How do we know? Okay, that is based on image. The Germany doesn't have a nuclear weapon. Okay, I will also the follow-up question. So suppose that there is a war between the Germany and India. So who's gonna win? India has a nuclear weapon and Germany doesn't. But still, 99% of students say that the Germany will win. That kind of opinion is based on the image and predisposed image, okay, of Germany. Okay, so based on the students, learning of history. Okay, and then that image may determine the understanding of the foreign relations and the understanding of foreign policy. And then if some of those students eventually go to the administration, and then they have influence in determining the foreign policies, or some of the students go to media and then try to report something related to the foreign relations, and those images will remain in the reporting and determining the policies and images of foreign countries. That's my guess. So in that sense, in addition to the information, the objective information, the predisposed images of foreign countries that the individuals, the journalists, and political analysts have may deserve more attention. And then that's what I would like to say today in my presentation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ha. Next, Professor Soe, would you give your answers to our discussants' comments? Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, as someone who spends a fair amount of time criticizing media coverage, or analyzing, right? So I think about, what can we do? If I were put in the position, as Tim just pointed out, to sort of overhaul or improve, what would I do? So I find myself thinking about this because I'm print media, that's where my roots are. I'm a very sort of old school traditional media person. I'm not too fond of the data journalism, AI doing journalism. I don't know, it doesn't just, I'm not as attractive, but I found myself thinking about these issues, considering the increasingly harsh conditions for journalists in many other countries, right? Take China, for example. Right. Yes, China is nowhere near as isolated or closed off as North Korea is. But think about the Xinjiang, Uyghur region, the Western provinces, right? Where, again, anybody entering, is monitored in real time. Journalists are not allowed permits to go there for quite a few years and so on. Anybody journalist talks to, it's really comparable to the situation in North Korea, where, of course, the walls had ears at Korea Hotel. I didn't want to talk to anybody in the streets for fear of, God knows what that person will get into. And I found myself thinking about it when I saw the this year's Pulitzer recipient, by the BuzzFeed people, right? Who probably, I know the main journalist. So the BuzzFeed piece that I'm referring to, they made a really good use of satellite pictures. They sort of triangulated, right? It wasn't just data journalism. They talked to a lot of good people who had escaped or who had previously lived in the concentration camps, or whatever you want to call it, these worked labor camps, where as many as 1 million people live. I forgot the numbers. And then they used, they triangulated areas blacked off in the Baidu maps, China's Google Maps, and then they used the European satellite images and then they brought in geospatial analysts trying to recreate, everyday life in these camps. Which clearly shows that these are not temporary facilities. These are there to stay. I think that was the name of the series. So again, I do think we could be, again, it's not going to solve the problem. And I'm not that rosy-eyed, but I do think there are rooms for us to tap more into slightly unconventional sources, if you will. Again, I realize this is not the answer, but I found myself thinking about it because I monitor media coverage pretty closely. And there was one instance where I was pretty certain that it was Kim Yo-jong who was leaving comments in the comments section. Why? Because seriously, it was a South Korean media story, and it dealt with the sort of internal political dynamics of like who's going to be promoted to what position. So it was one of the boring stories, actually. But then one of the comments was like, oh, the comment has an IP address of Pyongyang. That was a dead giveaway. I was like, wow, because again, not many people, it's only the foreigners and the top elites, but at the time, that website didn't filter. So if you look up the IP address, it's Pyongyang. And that person, it was also like a girl in Pyongyang was the ID, which also was like, and that person made a comment that basically predicted that, he's not gonna get promoted. And like less than a week later, that was the outcome. So, okay, somebody who has access to the internet, who brazenly says, I'm a girl in Pyongyang, who makes a correct prediction about cabinet reshuffle, I mean, the high rank, I think that's gotta be the royal family, I found myself thinking, right? And there's no chat function or I would have reached out. But also when it comes to traditional uses of human sources, I mean, I know that smugglers, I know you don't want to engage in illegal activities, but in it's sort of this gray area, obviously. But so I have been talking to other European scholars mostly who and again, if you're in academia, you have to get human subjects research approved. Unlike journalists, we need to go to the IRB review. And somebody got an IRB review to interview and survey North Koreans, not defectors, in China. So I was like, how were you able to do this? And it turns out that they sort of established this relationship with this entire group of workers who had sort of formed a sort of a cooperative company factory in China, in the border region. And they had the understanding that this was going to be used for academic purposes. I know journalists are not going to be able to do that, but again, kind of goes on to expand our imagination on the boundaries of what we can do in terms of data or sources. For scholars, it would be data. For journalists, it would be sources. And do not forget, I mentioned telephone because phone relays are a real thing too. In other words, the domestic only North Korean cell phones and the ones that if you put it in the border region with a Chinese SIM, you can pick up the Chinese international signals. So I actually know of scholars when they're doing research, they want to find out if the price of corn in the Hamgyong province has indeed gone up. And that person picks up the phone, calls the number China, and partly because it's mundane, not really politically sensitive stuff, but he actually finds a person in Hamgyong province through the phone relay and says, okay, so tell me about the corn prices in Hamgyong province last week. That person's actually doing research in inflation, but kind of goes on to show again, right, that, and I know with the COVID, everything became much more challenging. But I feel like journalists have always been at the forefront of finding what's happening despite the limitations, and I kind of want to keep that tradition, I think, even in North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Soe. Yeah. Does anyone want to add something before we wrap things up? Yeah. Final comments or any?
I mean, I would just say, I would just say quickly, briefly. Tim Martin, before he left, mentioned that he joked about whether we were covering at the summit Kim Jong-un or Kim Kardashian. But I don't know how, I don't know about your viewers in Korea, but I would say, look, I mean, consider you're Kim Kardashian and you're reading the stories about yourself. There's a lot of misinformation about you. There's a lot of sources putting out false statements. You're yourself putting out stories. President Trump used to be his own spokesman and call up New York media and place stories about himself to burnish his reputation, and they would be published. So all of this stuff is actually things that we deal with every day on almost every topic. And obviously the life and death situation of North Korea makes this maybe higher stakes in some ways. But Kim Kardashian was at the White House doing prison reform, criminal justice reform. She had Donald Trump ear. These are important things. We have to get it right. I recall, when I was at the summit, I stood outside the Singapore hotel for I think like 2 or 3 hours. Waiting with just ordinary people outside just the perimeter gates of the walled off streets to see Kim Jong-un come in his limousine, his armored limousine. And, while I stood there, I wanted to get just a view because at that I wasn't in the press pool that day. But then it dawned on me, there's a story here. You have a Singapore shopping street that's one of the wealthiest in the world, where people are enjoying their random sunny, Saturday or whatever day it was. And they're electing to stand here on the sidewalk to see one of the world's most brutal despots come down the street in a limousine so they can get a view of him. And they can get a view of his funny guards running around the car in that funny, overly dramatic way that they did on video. And what does that mean about us? Who are we? What does it say about us that we stand and want to watch somebody this bad? And so I wrote a story about that, and it was on the homepage of the Post. And I wrote about Kim Jong-un not wanting to use his airplanes because he didn't trust them. And sure enough, he went on a train and he went on Chinese air to this summit. And people wrote about, would he take the security step of bringing his own toilets? And these are human interest stories, but they do say something about us. And I think a lot of the coverage is trying to get at that beyond the sensational, even if it reads unusually provocative. I think a lot of it has to do with we're hungry to understand and hungry to know more. And we don't always get it right, but that's the goal. And I can tell you that, as Tim said, our colleagues in Asia and in Washington are trying to do as much on this story as we can. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
I wanted to just add one thing to what David said, because I find it irresistible. So North Korea is following coverage like that very closely, right? And just after that very summit, North Korea's official TV released a video, like a TV program, where it was exactly that scene. Sort of, it didn't shy away from the lights of Singapore, like they did a very, I think, a capitalistic sort of take on this whole panorama, and then they're of course putting their leader in the middle. But again, I mean, again, there are subtle but really important changes. For example, when a number of reporters repeatedly pointed out that North Korea has this dismal report, human rights record when it comes to people with disabilities, for example, and they have a national, organization called it used to be called National People for the Crippled or something like that, really sort of anarchistic, old language. And now they renamed it. So National Association for people with disabilities. So again, I mean, in their own way, right? They too have a desire to be understood and to connect and to communicate. So I think we're all North Korea, followers here. So I think I don't have to explain that to you. But again, I just wanted to point out that I think in this case, they were actually paying closer attention to your coverage. Just wanted to add that.
Thank you very much. Does anyone still have something to add? Or okay, let's wrap up today's seminar then. So I think one of the big takeaways from today's seminar is that it is apparent that media is not impartial or non-unbiased, intentionally or unintentionally. Yeah. There's also structural causes that incentivize journalists and media to produce errors and misinformation. Yeah. But how the media's portrayal of South Korea and North Korea could affect the US-South Korea relations would be the question that needs further investigation in the future. Yes. So this was the 5th of the 6th seminar scheduled for the 2021 ROK-US Think Tank Seminar Series. And thanks to our distinguished participants, we were able to have high-quality, constructive discussion regarding how American media portrays the two Koreas and the US-South Korea relations. And I thank you all, and Professor Soe and Mr. Nakamura, have a good night, and Professor Hai and Professor Jang, have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much for participating. Yeah, thank you.